Yalimadab. My name is Anar Amin, and I will be the moderator for today's conversation. Today's session focuses on how we think about concepts such as education and success and their relationship to questions of systemic oppression and inequity of our societies. During this session, you will also see a Q&A box through which you can share additional questions or thoughts during the presentation. We will try to address as many questions submitted during today's talk as we can. With that, let me introduce you to our wonderful panelists. Dr. Natasha Hakimali Merchant is an assistant professor of social studies and multicultural education at the University of Washington, Bothell, where she teaches courses in the social foundations of education. She has published in the areas of critical curriculum studies and critical citizenship education. Dr. Karim Dharamsi is a professor of philosophy and chair of general education at Mount Royal University in Calgary, Canada. He has published in the philosophy of history, on the philosophy of R.G. Collingwood, Wittgenstein, Frege, the philosophy of education, and liberal education. At the outset, we would like to note that the views of our speakers expressed during the course of this discussion are their own. Let's turn to our conversation. Natasha and Karim, welcome. How are y'all? Good. I just wanted to start off by saying that we have this title. It's a critical conversation, and it's titled Rethinking Education and Success, Questions of Systemic Oppression and Inequity. But before we even start with the topical questions, I'm curious, how are you both entering into this conversation? We'll start with Karim on that one.
Well, yelling with everybody, and thank you for inviting me to have this conversation, to Natasha, Anar, Farhana, and others, Nadim. Well, I guess an appropriate place might be to start with some caveats. Well, almost everyone, I suppose, listening today has been following the news in the United States, and I'm not Black or African American. I'm not subject to the same kinds of systemic racism as Black Americans are. But I do work and live on traditional lands of Treaty 7 Indigenous nations. And as a Canadian, we are all treaty people. And I think that I'm entering this conversation as a settler who, in some ways, unlike people who have a homeland of a particular kind, I don't. I have a constitutional status in Canada, and I'm Canadian, but it's precarious because I have certain kinds of responsibilities to those treaties and to the people who occupied this land long before I got here. And I think the conversation we're having is really important because our community can play an important role in addressing sort of the historical wrongs. But I'll stop there.
Thanks, Karim, and thanks, Anar, for having me on. I'm someone who occupies a brown body that is gendered. I am someone who comes from a lineage which has experienced great generational trauma. My family for generations has been displaced in many ways, and I find myself here living on occupied Duwamish land. And I also am a beneficiary of the atrocities that have happened upon the Black body in the United States. And I greatly benefit from that. I have a lot of economic privilege and stability, and my family enjoys that a great deal today. I'm also someone entering this conversation because somehow, and words will fail me, but somehow I'm informed by my faith around ideas of what justice is and somewhat of a morality that is not neutral, regardless of what's going on in the world, but particularly at this moment, that's sort of what I'm grappling with and thinking through. I also feel like the experiences of my ancestors have provided me with a certain outlook and wisdom, which is more experienced and felt beyond what I can sort of process cognitively. Through that, I have been feeling a lot of anger these days, a lot of anger in reconciling how folks who previously were silent on issues of racial injustice are now suddenly awake, and I find myself sometimes being a little bit maybe suspect of motives when I see, for instance, companies kind of jumping on and promoting the sort of humanity of Black folks in particular in the United States. I find I'm spending a lot of energy and time sort of thinking about that, getting upset about it. I'm also feeling really hopeless and tired of trying to articulate why racial injustices exist, whether I'm doing that with, family, friends, strangers, community members. And I find myself in this space where I feel I feel a lot of righteous indignation. And then I also have this moment of self-loathing sometimes, because of course this is all of our jobs and I'm not beyond any of this. Of course, I have my own blind spots, and I'm struggling a lot too to think about all of the ways in which I benefit from systems that are based on inequity, and asking myself really tough questions around whether I'm willing to sacrifice and what I'm willing to sacrifice. So this is how I'm entering into this conversation.
Thank you, Natasha, for being so open and vulnerable and sharing your anger with us. But picking up on this mention of righteous indignation, can you share a little bit about what you've been thinking through, and how are you kind of filtering through the thoughts that you have about this anger towards injustice that you see?
Yeah, so I was hoping to share this quote that, I first came across when I was an undergraduate student a while ago, and this has brought new meanings for me. It's from Sister Outsider. I'm wondering if we can pull it up right now. This is a quote from Audre Lorde. And when I first came across this, the only part I had seen was the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And it had a particular meaning for me, and that's sort of changed over time, but I'd like to read the whole passage from this essay. Those of us who stand outside the circle of the society's definition of acceptable woman, those of us who have been forged into the crucibles of difference, those of us who are poor, who are lesbians, who are Black, who are older, know that survival is not an academic skill. It is learning how to stand alone, unpopular and sometimes reviled, and how to make common cause with those others identified as outside the structure in order to define and seek a world in which we can all flourish. It is learning how to take our differences and make them strengths. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. And this fact is only threatening to those women who will define the master's house as their only source of support. And so many would say that she was talking about a larger feminist project, which is ignoring third world feminism and Black feminism, Indigenous feminism. But for me, it holds so much more meaning. And when I think about this in the moment, and I think about, so how do I channel my own energy and think about what allyship means, who I'm in conversation with, it really has a lot of meaning, because I've been trying to look for some kind of moral coherence or moral purity. And when I look at the university where I work, for instance, I'm not finding that, because my entire job, or a big part of my job, is based on a system that basically says to students, and the majority of students I teach are first generation college going students. They're taking lots of loans and they're going to be in debt for a very long time to get a degree, which they're told is the only way they can have success in life and is going to give them some sort of value and status. And I am benefiting from that. And, very ironically teaching them about how messed up all of that is. And I'm getting my paycheck, and I still am very lucky to have a job not everybody does in my field. But that's something that I have to live with. So I'm not finding moral coherence there When I look to community structures, of course, we're all grappling, and structures have hierarchies. Hierarchies are also based on, social divisions and hierarchies. So I'm not finding moral coherence and some sort of moral purity even within my community, and then even within myself, as I spoke about earlier. If I really want to sit down and think, well, how do I even disentangle all the ways in which I'm really committed to systems of supremacy that are, forged on other people? How will I change my behavior as a consumer, the way I live, the things I read, the music I listen, everything? There isn't a sort of there isn't a moral coherence there either. So I find myself really going back to this quote and thinking about, well, what are the ways in which I can undo or start to be in community with people to sort of undo this master's house? And what is that house anyway? And what are these tools? How does a certain way of speaking, a certain kind of education, how am I sort of propping up and perpetuating and reproducing that same sort of tool set and building up that house even greater?
Thank you. Gurney, what are your thoughts about all of this?
I think the Lord quote is, and Natasha's reflections on it are inviting us to diagnose a particular kind of, let's say, a political theory or a particular kind of political history in the West that we've all succeeded in, or at least we find privilege in, and that maybe it invites us to sort of trace its history a little bit and to figure out why the standards of success or the conceptions of success that we have adopted are the ones that they are. And maybe to do that, Anar, can you maybe pull up the W.E.B. Du Bois quote? And then I want to try and connect that to the master's tool house metaphor that Lord uses. So Du Bois is an academic who is really quite important in sociological circles because he was an African-American sociologist, Harvard trained, worked throughout the United States. But he was the first sociologist to sort of snatch sociology away from philosophy, in that he went into the world and did statistical analyses. He conducted what today we would call, in the university circle, sort of mixed methods approaches, where there's quantitative and qualitative forms of research. And he was trying to figure out, in the education of Black people, which is the title of the text, what exactly is the inheritance? What does the master's house look like? And where does it sort of get perpetuated? So here's what he says. The quote starts after he has given a sort of a rehearsal of American and European education. He goes after Cambridge, Eton, the private school where some famous prime ministers have been. And then he says that those universities, for all of their great effort and their standards, including the one he was at, he says this type of university training has deeply impressed the world. It is the foundation for a tenacious legend preserved in fiction, poetry, and essay. There are still many people who quite instinctively turn to this sort of thing when they speak of a university. And out of this ideal arose one even more exotic part. Instead of the university growing down and seeking to comprehend in its curriculum the life and experience, the thought and expression of lower classes, it almost invariably tended to grow up and narrow itself to a sublimated elite of mankind. And what Du Bois is suggesting, he's a critic of the liberal tradition, what we would today maybe characterize as mainstream liberalism. So let's take it back a step and try to connect Du Bois to our own immigration history, our own experiences as Ismailis who've come to the West. When we came here, the one thing we learned through language like multiculturalism and, say, the other embedded language like a pluralistic democracy, is that there are going to be competing conceptions of the good life, but there's no particular way in which those competing views can find a sort of decision procedure to decide which one is the best. So the Christian, the Jew, the Muslim, the Buddhist, the Hindu, and others, the indigenous person, can sort of live out their lives in the liberal state and have their protections. But in the public square, there is this assumption that it's a neutral space, a kind of public neutrality with regard to the other vested interests. And with that comes the idea that your own personal interests are relegated to the private sphere. So as a Muslim or a Jew or a Christian or whatever you want, yes, you live in a pluralistic democracy that protects your rights, but, and that's attractive, but they're relegated to the private sphere, because in the public sphere, there's something going on that the protection looks like. And Du Bois is suggesting that the master's house in Lord's language that's propagated through the university has, in his phrase, it's laid the foundation for a tenacious legend that's preserved in our curriculum. It's preserved in our poetry, in our fiction, in the way that we identify ourselves and the way we acquire an identity within the liberal state. So that the idea is that state neutrality is not really neutral at the end of the day. It asks you to give up something of the private sphere so that you can succeed and be or meet the benchmarks that that tradition sets for you. So in Canada, for example, that's really a large Protestant ethic that comes from a large-scale European intervention into Canada or North America. It sets up the structures of power, the legal, the educational, and what have you. And we now, as let's say in Du Bois's case, the Black person who is now going to places like Harvard, a standard setter, a gold standard for education, is now going to bear witness to the foundation of this tenacious legend. And by doing that, they become part of the public square or public reason, which only in a kind of sleight of hand looks like it's neutral, because it uses the language of neutrality. But its history is not neutral, and the way that it carves out its benchmarks for success are not neutral. So one way in which we think about, say, for example, our own sort of systems of inequity is that if you are going to succeed, then you have to meet those benchmarks. And there's a tracking that happens from the time that you're a young person, the other part of the liberal narrative. And, you know, look, to put my cards on the table, I'm sort of a liberal communitarian. That's sort of where the tradition I come from, right, as a philosophy professor. But one can't do that and not also be robustly critical of that tradition for how it doesn't invite easy revision. So one of the things that it takes for granted, and we do it, is that, well, liberal in the terms of individual freedom and its protection of individual freedom presupposes that you must have chosen this trajectory, that you are free as an agent to choose it. And so there are these two bits that go together. One is that you have multiple conceptions of the good life, and they're competing. But the state says, we're not going to decide which one is right. So you all get equal protection. And since you are part of a liberal state, you must have chosen this particular way of living out your life. The underlying assumption is that it's neutral. It's neutral with regard to these different competing conceptions of the good life. But in fact, it is not neutral. And we see its lack of neutrality, its sense of systemic prejudice realized in Canada every single day, whether it's against people of color or more explicitly against Indigenous people, or we see it in the United States quite explicitly in the case that is sort of on everyone's mind with George Floyd. But of course, that it's surprising that that sort of gets the news when it's happening every single day in the United States. But I'll stop there. Natasha, did you want to? I'm sorry, maybe I just went on too long.
No, not at all. I think it's really interesting for me to think about, like, what is a choice and when are we backed into corners, to think about what will get counted as success and worthiness, and sort of like the desirability that Lord talks about even in her quote, or being acceptable woman, I think she says. And that's something that I think is so hugely important, and the educational systems that we have, whether formal or informal, have a way of I mean, if it's not too strong of a word, indoctrinating us into sort of the ways to at least mimic that acceptability. And I think, therefore, this false sense that everything is sort of neutral. So I really appreciated that point.
There's there's a sense in which the Imam has given a speech that is quite well known. I think it's the Baldwin Lafontaine lecture, where he, in speaking about institutions, he says that there is a reciprocal relationship between culture and institutions. And I think that what Du Bois is trying to do in a latter part of the text, when he's talking about the Negro College, which is the chapter title, what he's trying to suggest is that if we want to see true liberation for Black Americans, they have to start to see a reciprocal relationship between their history and their history of overt violence in the institutions that propagate the social norms. And that means rethinking the norms substantively in almost a revolutionary sense through institutions and culture. So, of course, we have to protest. We have to write letters. We have to write essays. In Natasha's case and mine, maybe we have to write long essays that only a few people might read, at least in my case. But the point is that ultimately, the institutions become the locus for rethinking the project of cultural regeneration and revolution. They're not independent of those movements on the street. And I think that's sort of why Du Bois is so important as a voice within African American studies.
I think for me, it also makes me think about the importance of education outside of the formal schooling system, and really making a differentiation between education, or really thinking about education within schooling, which also has its own history. If we look at, for instance, the history of boarding schools in both the United States and Canada, and really their incredible policy to kill the Indian, save the child, right? Make sure that assimilation happens at any cost, so that this person can be worthy of even being called human, or a child in this case. And I think that legacy lives on today as well. And so it gives me a little bit of pause to think about, in what ways are we as a community thinking about education as separate from the schooling system. And that's an area in which I would really love to see our community sort of challenge itself, because right now, and I kind of wanted to give an anecdote from an early research study that I had done with Ismaili girls in the US. And this was, with high school girls who had experienced the events of September 11th when they were in elementary school. So I did this a while ago. But one thing that was really startling from their experiences is that I had them do a textual sort of read aloud from their world history textbook. And I had them read aloud on the section where they were reflecting on the Shia-Sunni schism. And it was like so short, right? It was like 3 or 4 lines, but those 3 or 4 lines were enough to give a perspective about what happened and how it went down. As you know, so many of these girls were reading aloud and kind of giving their thoughts about what they were reading. They surprised me and expressed to me that, how come our RECs never taught us this? And that was really heartbreaking for me as someone who was an appa in the community, considered like an older sister for so many of these girls, and like an former REC teacher, because it was like, wow, you're going to give that sort of credibility to your history textbook in school, but you're not going to give the credibility to your community-based education system on who you are and what your history is. And so I think the depth of that kind of view, indoctrination, supremacy that we see. I mean, in so many ways, it has penetrated and colonized our being, from our language to the way we think. I mean, absolutely everything. And so I really would call upon us to think about how, first of all, what are our sort of, if things are not neutral, what are those values? What are we educating toward and for? And then how are we participating in formal schooling as well? Because it has to be more than just, oh, this is the grade A school, right? Which is going to look a certain way. And what does that mean about our participation in the history that we're in the process of making? Because we cannot simply just look at each individual child and think about what's best for my child. I would argue that that is actually, we are morally compelled and obligated to think beyond that view.
I was just wondering too, as you're mentioning, Natasha, that what if we chose schools and universities that actually equipped us to dismantle some of these supremacist institutions? And what if we actually kind of flipped the whole value of education, even the purpose of education, and then we provided these tools to be able to do so? Do we even know which institutions those are here in the United States that we should be going to? So just a thought that I wanted to put out there to see if we can discuss a little bit.
Well, I mean, I think that was meant for you, Natasha, but do you want me to take a shot? Well, I think the one sign that there's a kind of threat that the universities are trying to adopt a critical stance. For example, in Canada, after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there's been an aggressive move to hire Indigenous faculty, to be far more explicit about Canadian complicity in oppression, to introduce language of colonization to the Canadian context. We have Stephen Harper, who is well known by Americans. He sometimes writes subversive op-eds in the in the Financial Times or something, or Wall Street Journal. But the point is that we are seeing the universities trying to address historical wrongs. However, you can tell there's a threat because governments in Canada are changing universities themselves by introducing narrow metrics for funding. For example, they want employable candidates. They want professional training. They want fewer humanities and social science courses. And I think that the nice illusion, and one is the commitment to STEM research or STEM subjects, or the so-called STEAM. I think these are just other ways of instrumentalizing education to meet sort of economic metrics and to betray the main reason why we have higher education. It's not just to get a job. It's to, as someone said in the questions, and I'm sorry, I can't follow them because there's way too many, but it was, I think it was Raheel Lakhani who said, well, aren't universities, given the resources to critique or something? And I apologize, Raheel, if I've messed that up. But, well, yes, in spirit, that's true. Because faculties that have people like Natasha and perhaps even philosophers hired exist. But they don't exist in the same way as engineers, lawyers to some extent, healthcare workers or healthcare faculties, medicine. And those are all important, by the way. Business colleges, those are all important. The question is, what kind of education are you going to get? Is it going to be augmented by a greater understanding of your democracy and of your responsibilities? There's no prima facie reason for you to obey the law. There's no prima facie reason. You have to believe that you are a reasonable agent who believes the laws are just. And how do you acquire a sense of critique of what is just? Wherever you land on the political spectrum, you would want to enjoin your institutions of higher learning to give you the kind of breadth required for you to assess the democracy you live in. And whether it's questions about immigration or land claims or climate change or what have you, you want to have as much understanding as possible of what's happening around you. Now, the question about the success narrative that's sort of, that Natasha and I are talking about, Well, the question for us should be, you know, when we first came here, my family in the 1970s, early 70s, everyone's just trying to get a job and get their kids to school. We're new immigrants, we're trying to figure it out. Canada is great, it has all the right lingo. We don't even know there are Indigenous people, because Indigenous people to us are white Christian Protestants, Indigenous to Ontario. And when you're in school, you say the Lord's Prayer, you sing, "Oh Canada, life is great. Mom and dad tell you, be a doctor." I fail at that, but you try, right? You sort of meet the demands. Now, here's this generation that has cut their teeth as liberal Democrats broadly, right? You grow up in a society that gives you some of the privileges that your parents worked hard for you to achieve. But now, where is the capacity that we have as sort of being part of creating the infrastructure and the institutions? What is our self-reflective contribution? How do we go back and say, okay, so this is what we're going to do. We've inherited the structure. Where is our contribution to it and its efficacy in thinking about the future? By the way, the other thing that's interesting about Du Bois and Lord is neither of them assume that the world you have inherited is the world you will leave, right? There's a sense that they want social change and that we can be instruments for social change, no matter what your profession, whether you're a business person or a philosophy professor, less so with the philosophy professor, granted, but you can all be involved in social change and in revolutionary vocabulary that then translates into actions, everything from voting the right way, whatever that might mean, but thoughtfully. Whatever you decide, those institutions are going to reciprocate by expressing your values. So you have to ask yourself, do I value those things? Is that the kind of world I want to live in? And the universities in Canada, for example, are going to struggle because the public square is changing, it's shifting. And in Alberta, just this week, you know, there's a commission being hired to evaluate post-secondary education for employability and for professions that can be measured for how they contribute to the Alberta economy. But there is nothing that says we need to make sure we educate people to support a democratic ethos that includes rights and respect for different groups to coexist. There's nothing like that.
And I think about like how advantageous that kind of education might be to the current system. And if I look at just what I've been taught as a 1.5 generation immigrant who came to the US when I was very young, is that there's an acknowledgement always in my upbringing that there is supremacy. It looks a certain way, it talks a certain way, and that's the reality. However, I very much have received the messages of, hey, beat them at their own game, right? That's what success is. But when you have an economic model where there are winners and losers, then what you're being encouraged to do essentially is to be a winner without looking back. And then we're told, no, but make sure that your own brethren, you're bringing them up with you, right? Because there are systemic inequities. But if we only bring ourselves up, then again, on whose back? And so what's becoming more and more clear is that this sort of myth that everybody has equal opportunity, if you pay any attention to the historical or contemporary record, it is not true whether you look at the law or whether you look at how various systems function, or you look at implicit bias and how strong that is. Wherever you look, you will see that if a system is made with winners or losers, we not only think of losers as those who have a certain set of circumstances, but we also criminalize them. People who are unhoused are actually seen as undesirable to the point of being associated as criminals because they're not contributing in a certain way to the labor market. And that makes them completely sort of separate as a humanity almost, in the way that we frame them in society. And so I think this whole idea of beating them at their own game, I think what gets lost in that grind is our soul, really. And so I think the question of development work, whether that's self-development, community development, or even international development, really needs to be looked at. And I think education is used quite neutral, you know, it's seen very neutrally as the springboard to that success narrative. And I can't speak to what my parents' experience was to try and get a foothold in the US. You know, but I think that I can only speak to where I am right now and the kind of call that Audre Lorde has to sort of try to define and shape a future where all can flourish. Is that possible? While I might be a cynic, I do think it's worth spending the entirety of one's life to try and chip away at that kind of project.
No, Natasha, I'm glad that you mentioned that. And I'm just reflecting on my own role as a step teacher and what, you know, we've been taught and what is our role in the REC centers and what type of education we're also giving. And I know that we have been discussing a lot with the youth about what you can do to be change makers in society. What is it that you actually want to get in terms of like, what is your legacy? What do you want to leave behind, right? And we try our best to do that. And I know this is only like 10 years old of a program and all the guidance that's been coming from the Imam, but what do you think that we can do as inequity kind of infiltrates our secular education? How do we combat it into the REC centers? What tools can we provide the students to be able to differentiate between, you know, what is systematic oppression versus pure empathy, or is empathy even a thing here that we should focus on?
Karim, I will leave it to you to first break everyone's heart on empathy so that I can look better after you speak.
You will look a lot better. You will look a lot better. Well, you know, I was hoping that Natasha would take that first. I think that empathy is important enough. It is of course important. However, I certainly don't think empathy is enough, and I think that we elevate empathy to the central point of guiding our moral commitments to the detriment of what we mean by our moral commitments. So, for example, there are Indigenous people in Canada who live and work and toil on Indigenous lands, and sometimes at my university where I teach. And I want to make sure that my work does not ever betray the fact that they are full persons and full citizens in the Canadian context, independently of whether I can experience the kind of life they've lived or the kinds of racism they faced or systemic discrimination they faced over generations. I can't even pretend to get into that space as a Canadian. Now, the way that empathy is usually trotted out by those who are interested in moral reasoning is that empathy becomes the way in which I can put myself in someone else's shoes so that I understand what they're going through. When Beatrice Stowe writes Uncle Tom's Cabin, there's a sense in which I really get the plight of Black people, and so this makes me a better person. I can go out and do certain things with myself and be morally efficacious. Now, that's well and good, and in fact, there's probably some role to that. However, I think that on the other side of that is that I want to extend rights and full citizenship to people I don't empathize with, that I don't necessarily want to elevate my empathy to the mechanism by which I would accept another person as fully a citizen or a person or whatever. Now, just to add a little bit to that, the thing about empathy that makes it kind of interesting too is that it creates a category, in my opinion, and I'm not the only one. I mean, there's a lot of literature on this, but I just happen to be sympathetic to it. That when I empathize, I'm creating a category of a kind that suggests this other person is like me. That somehow I can understand their experiences, their feelings, their values on terms that I set, but that are synonymous with their terms. So it takes a lot for granted empathy. It takes for granted synonymy of meaning. If I'm going to, say, describe someone's pain and then put it in language and sanctions that belong to me. And I think, okay, that makes sense. Therefore, because you're a lot like me, you should have these rights because I have them. Now, that doesn't mean empathy is not a part of the game, but it's not the first part. The first part might be, oh, I really don't get anything about this, but you are certainly an equal, because that is a moral commitment that's independent of my ability to domesticate your feelings, domesticate your history. And I think that in the REC, the question you're asking, Anar, about STEP, I think that when it comes to institutional vocabulary, I don't mean institution as in the Ismaili institutions, I mean the vocabulary used to talk about schooling and education, when we talk about health and the law. It's that empathy can be part of that for sure. We want to read interesting literature. We want to listen to fascinating music. We want to try and make sense of the stories that make up Indigenous history. But we don't want to work with the pretense that we have the capability to fully appreciate the historical wrongs that have been committed by our state and really in our name. Just because I got here in 1970 something doesn't mean that I'm not complicit in holding up the oppression that predates my existence even, right? So so I think that the curriculum can reflect both those parts, to say that we want to introduce a rights vocabulary that is reasonable, that makes sense of why we understand the rights of others, applying to those people because they're full members and they don't require our empathy for full membership.
And nor could we ever, in any kind of realistic way, ever do it anyway. So for me, my worry about empathy is that it becomes a shortcut to not acknowledging all of the complicity and doing the really difficult grappling. And there are two cases I actually want to talk about, which I think are so fascinating. Most of us, of course, we do have those who are Black Ismailis, they're not really seen in these public platforms, right? We also have Ismailis who are Indigenous. We also have Ismailis who are sort of at the fringes in many other regards. But what I can say is the majority in terms of like the dominant power structure is very much sort of South Asian dominant Khoja, regardless of where we enter through the diaspora. And so I think these cases that I'm going to mention are really relevant for us to think about how we can't even pretend to have empathy as a starting point. And these cases come from the 1920s when there was more Asian migration and the desire for naturalized citizenship. At that time, the naturalization rule was that you can apply for naturalization if you are a white person who's an alien, right? So if you are falling under the social racial construction of white, or because slavery had officially come to a close, you can also be considered a full citizen, though we know that in terms of functioning rights, that wasn't the case. But according to the law, you can also be a full citizen if you're Black. Now, what are you to do if you're neither white nor Black? The law is that you have to then petition for your citizenship, and you have to claim that you are either white or Black. Now, what is an Asian to do, right? Like, what do you think? What would you choose in that system, which is set up in a hierarchy? And so in the Ozawa case that happened in 1922, that was decided by the Supreme Court, a Japanese man who had lived the majority of his life in the United States, spoke, perfect English, was church going, in fact, went to high school in the US, went to college in the US. He presented all of these facts and his sort of moral good character, as he described it, to basically say that, look, I am in fact white, right? Because those were the characteristics of this thing called whiteness, because we know that category of who is white has shifted over time, whereas certain people who would be considered white today were not considered white previously. And so he wanted in on that in order to get his citizenship, and he was denied. Then we have Bhagat Singh Thind, who actually fought within the for the US Army in World War I, just the year after, in 1923, he was granted citizenship under a provision that said he would get it if he fought, but then the case was reviewed and it was revoked. His citizenship was revoked. He went to court to say, oh, I'm white. And the reason I'm white, and he was turbaned and had a beard. And he said, the reason I'm white is because of all these things, like I have good character, I'm, well educated. He also went to school in Northern California, went to university. But he also said that not only am I Aryan, but in terms of being from Northern India, but also I'm from an upper caste family. And for me, that, in India, the caste system is so profound that having that superior status is much like being white in the US in terms of the relationship between between white supremacy and sort of anti-Blackness. And so therefore, in that way, I know how to be white. And that was a very serious argument. Although there is a school of thought that says that like he was using that argument, his lawyer was using that to prove a point actually, but nevertheless, he was not granted whiteness and therefore not granted his citizenship at that moment through that court case. And the reason I bring this up is I think it's really important for us to think about empathy in this case also, because these ways in which many of us have had access and adjacency to supremacy, or have at least tried, and I would say have succeeded in large part. I think that in these ways, we have to acknowledge, again, if the system is one of hierarchy and winners and losers, in what way are we making ourselves sort of relative to those who are on the bottom of those hierarchies? And where are we aligning ourselves? And again, the question for myself as a Ismaili is always like, is there a disconnect here between my actions and my drive for success and the best education, however I'm defining that? Is there a disconnect between that and what I've been taught as early as, 5 and 6 years old about the right kind of behavior and who I want to align with and what I want to live my life for? And I think so many people are seeing a very simple ethical inconsistency in that. And we can keep telling ourselves, as I have been for my whole life, that no, I just got to get in the club, then I can change it from within. But I think that's something I need to look at more critically, and I think all of us need to engage with, is there a certain point where we amass a certain kind of power and status and recognition, and then we can start to change it, or are we just becoming part of the issue? And has that been an ongoing process in our histories?
With the two cases that you described, Natasha, like you either have this option or that option. Nobody thought about the middle, the gray shaded area, the brownness factor. So I guess for a lot of us that are actually listening in today, like what can we actually do, right? Not just like looking at it critically from one lens or the other, but what do we do? How do we move forward from here? And either of you can chime in.
Karim, do you want to go or shall I?
Okay. Well, no, why don't you just to extend your point that you were making? Do you want to do that, or do you want
now
to?
I have to extend my point. Okay. So I think there are several things that we can do, and I would say in this moment, so many people have mobilized to action, and I actually think that's amazing and wonderful. And as much of a cynic as I am, I've calmed down recently to think that no, this is what needs to happen, is that even if people are putting their Black Instagram square, it's a start, right? It's definitely a start for us to think about this. But the first thing that needs to happen on the same note of empathy is that we actually need to do more listening before talking. I think that who we need to listen to in particular are the people who are like experts in what we're getting so riled up about, because there's a lot of knowledge, there's a lot of struggle, there's a lot of work that's been ongoing. It didn't just happen because we woke up today, right? Like Karim mentioned, George Floyd was not the first Black man to be brutalized. In fact, it happens on the daily, on the regular, and it is one of the features of the building of our of what we call the United States today. And so that is a fact. There's nothing to suggest there's an uptick in those kinds of brutalities, right? So how are we actually centering the knowledge and the wisdom and the work, the labor of people who understand this and know this in a very real way? And then how are we amplifying those voices? I think that's something that can be done. And that's very frustrating, I notice, for a lot of people, because people want to do something, they get angry and they think that means a certain kind of action right away. And to me, I really worry that that energy is going to fizzle out. You know, are we ready to feel ashamed of what we haven't known? Are we ready to be pulled up short again and again by learning new things and thinking like, where have I been? You know, where has this been all my life? Are we ready to be really disturbed and consider what sacrifices can I make? Are we ready to take ourselves out of the center and of these struggles and really think about amplifying the work that has already been done? I think the other critical work that we need to do is with each other, in our homes, in our communities, through education efforts, because what also happens is that the people who have been in the center of this struggle for so long now have to stop and explain things to us and educate us, because there has been a lack of this education very intentionally in our public school systems and even in our universities, where you know, more and more people are not taking liberal arts and humanities. That's not happening. And even within our Jamaat, we see, you know, what the majors are. And so it is very likely that people have gone their entire lives and not really known about these realities. So we cannot put the burden on other people to teach us and say, like, educate us. I really don't like reading, like, tell me what your struggle is. That's not acceptable, right? If people can be dying on the streets and have sacrificed their children integrating into schools, you can like read some books and do some work and talk to each other and have important conversations. So I would say that doing this work in community with each other, especially as people who are largely like not Black, I think that's really, really important to do with each other so we can reduce the harm that we're perpetuating. I also think conversations are really difficult to have with people we love so much who may not see things the way that we do. And one thing that I have to remind myself of on the daily is that we are all swimming in the same water, and supremacy, white supremacy, patriarchy, all of these things dictate our life, right? So when you hear like your grandparents or your cousin or whoever it is say things that are upsetting to you, and we're hearing these cases more and more in the Jamaat, right? Where a lot of people are just super frustrated with their family members, there's discord in households. When you hear those things, also remember that this is white supremacy in our minds, in our homes, all around us, and there's a great sense of loss as well. So it's really no surprise that we all don't have this knowledge, because if we all knew this kind of brutality would not happen. We wouldn't allow it to happen. So whether we're willfully or unwillfully sort of you know, allowing this, the first step I think is really listening and then educating each other, and then amplifying those voices, giving money where we can to raise up those voices, and at the very least, neutralizing people in our families and communities so that they're not doing active harm, and really like get out of the way for the movement to continue, because it started 400 years ago, you know, it didn't start now. And so I think that would be my advice.
Those are amazing. Thank you, Natasha. Kareem?
I am just very briefly, I think that one of the things that Natasha is gesturing at, and maybe even actually being explicit about in terms of listening in particular, is that you know, we as a community have some animating sort of concepts that have come from the Imam over the span of my lifetime, certainly. Things like meritocracy, we talk of pluralism, we have discussions about a cosmopolitan ethic. Now, if if you do what I do for a living, those things can't coexist happily. They have to be teased apart and made sense of, and in fact, maybe even repackaged to make sense. But if we try to think about, I saw one question come up on merit. Well, the thing is that not everyone starts at the same starting line. So it is the case that within a mainstream liberal society, the assumption of merit is that when you're being admitted to a university, your A grade or your B grade or your C grade is the same as the A, B, and C from another person. It's stripped of its context, its history, your struggle, whatever it might be. And I think that as a community, one thing that we can do is to really start to interrogate the concepts we use to describe ourselves and to make sense of ourselves. Now, why would that be the case? I think that our history provides us with an essential mode of understanding ourselves that's really quite different from a scientific understanding. History gives us concepts that are quite different. And that means that our past is intelligible in some way. It's not just myth-making. It has a kind of intelligible force that tells us why certain concepts can be efficacious in self-understanding, and that project of self-understanding, lifelong as it may be, is something that is a possibility. It's that there's no just so story, that just because these concepts sort of exist around you, it doesn't mean that they are defined. You are an agent that can define them, redefine them, and also create new ones. One of the things I've been really heartened by watching more as a voyeur, no doubt, the discussions online by many young people, is that we have a really solid base of intellectuals coming up the pipe who are really, really interesting, thoughtful young people. And they can invent the new concepts. They can provide us with meanings, because history is not something that just stops. Self-understanding, critiques of concepts, and ideas about what we ought to be, what we ought to do, those are generative. They come from us. And that's one thing that is very heartening, that so many people have decided to discuss what's going on, but with a level of fervor that I haven't seen before. Bless you. I'll stop there.
Natasha, I really liked your point when you mentioned that you have to like neutralize the conversation at the home front too, and then Karim, you came in to talk about these concepts that are already out there. And I know a conversation that we were having before was that even the Imam, as he guides us, like these concepts are already given to us from a very young age, and then we grow up and we go outside and we see them come to life. And then we question ourselves to say, well, how do I then belong to that, conversation? And I think that that's so important for us to also understand that within this society and this community that we do have two various ends of the spectrum, where you may not get anything out of a conversation with someone that you're speaking to at home, whereas you have, scholars that you go to REC with, or you have conversations with at an IPN seminar, etc. And, as we interact with a lot of other people, your point about just like letting the movement happen, right? Like, so don't come in the way, I thought was really, really strong. And I want to thank you both, Natasha and Karim, for taking us through some of these very reflective thoughts. And I know many of us will have to do a little bit more homework actually to really understand all of the ideas that you provided for us. And for that, the audience, we actually have a list of sources that both Karim and Natasha have graciously compiled for you. And I'll post those in the chat soon. But Karim and Natasha, are you okay if we move on to some of the audience questions? I think there's some burning ones that are there that have come through. So the first one that we have is asking, if we are actually serious about pluralism in the world, then why are our communities primarily living in affluent neighborhoods? And how does that insulate them from being in solidarity with our other communities of color? And then the follow-up to that is, how does that promote the model minority myth, where our communities, despite being people of color, are promoting white supremacy?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really tough question. And it's a question that is like almost heart-wrenching, because So many of us have seen the struggle, and many of us are in the struggle. We also can't assume that we are all sort of living in affluent suburbs, but I think we can easily say that that is like a goal, and a lot of our programming is to try and move to those neighborhoods because of the way segregation is done in the US, so that we can go to those good schools and get a certain kind of, it's all like perpetuating in the hopper to reproduce this inequity, right? That's sort of the unintended goal in order to get to that success, whatever that is. And I think it's a really difficult question, which is the same question about like reproducing gender norms. It's the same question around anything in any kind of cycle of socialization where you will get rewarded if you comply. And so we are mimicking these things. How do we stop? I think the only thing I can say is it takes great sacrifice, but also if we build cooperatives and we build sort of this idea of a sangha or ummah or chosen family, even within the larger community of people that say, look, we're going to have similar values and figure out how to operationalize these in the way that what we consume, how we do things. I think when we have financial independence to make those choices together, it can feel a lot less scary and less isolating, and then to come up with, well, how do we want to make this community better? How do we actually want to enrich it, which is a very different thing than gentrification and sort of like exploiting certain kinds of ideas of like Blackness and urbanality, if that's a word, I have no idea. But you know, the kinds of things that happen a lot with gentrification, but really this idea of how do we want to live our values. I don't think that I have the strength to do that without the people in my Ismaili community who I know that I have the feelings and the values that I have, not because I studied it in school, but there was something, either it was taught to me by my parents or and grandparents, but more likely it's I feel, and I have no empirical evidence for this except my own feelings, which I think is the strongest thing I could point to, but this is just deposited in me through generations of wisdom and knowledge. That's my belief. And so I know that the people within my community I share this with feel really similarly. Together, if we can sort of build a coalition and grapple with these things and think about that, then we can figure out ways forward. And I think that then we also then become an influence within the larger community, right? Because even our Jamaati institutions are made of people, they're all influenced. We're all in the same boat. So I think we can start in that way and then build out. And that's sort of the practical reality. I think there are other things we can do to try and take the current system of capitalism down step by step. I don't know how fruitful it would be, but I think that it's certainly worth a try.
Anar, do you want to ask the next question, or do you want me to also add something to what Natasha said?
If there's something to add, please do.
I think that some of the interesting critiques that have come, not so much from sort of thinkers, Ismaili thinkers, but just recently African-American thinkers, people that I think some of it's in the resource list, but certainly people like Ta-Nehisi Coates and others have observed that one of the problems with, first of all, not everyone who lives in Calgary or Toronto or Houston lives in affluent neighborhoods if they're Ismaili, but maybe that's not sort of the question. It's that the system itself is set up in terms of self-interest and self-gain. And there's no easy solution, because no matter how much rhetorical weight a rights dialogue can have, translating that into one's life is extremely difficult. We all have kids, we all have particular goals, we want them to live certain kinds of lives. And there's the myth of the Canadian dream that we want everyone to have. I bet even Americans want that dream, the Canadian one. And there's like this idea that, you know, if I lose something, if I give something, I might not get that dream. So I think that the question is actually quite a bit more difficult to answer. And I think Natasha's right. There is every particular society, if you know, are a student of history, you'll know that everyone thinks that they're at the end of it, that we are living, much like some of you in the audience will have read people like Fukuyama and others who talk about the end of history. This is the end of the liberal project, that we are all basically happy. Now we're just engaged in fine-grained disputes, you know, things like should animals have rights? Well, of course they should. That's beside the point. But you know, those are fine-grained disputes once the larger liberal project is settled. But the one that's lurking in the background is that this is going to end too. And are we ahead of it? Do we know what kind of society we want ahead of what pathological kinds of inequities there are now? And so that might not address why some people live in gated communities in parts of the States and Canada, and some live in neighborhoods they don't want to live in. But what it can do is say that we know this exists and we know we need to deal with it. And that narrative might come after you and I are gone. But that's why, especially those of you who are in the comment chats or whatever, the younger people, people like me, Natasha, others, we need to continue to think about this. And it's and really to invent the language and the arguments that are necessary. Now, look, I do philosophy for a living, so I believe in those things. I also know they can fail, but we have to continue to strive to do that.
I also, oh, sorry, I wanted to say one more thing. I'm not sure how many people are in a situation where they're not completely financial dependent right now, or independent, sorry, in the audience. I'm in a situation right now, I live with my family, and I'm really blessed to have that safety net. That's a privilege in and of itself. And then they enjoy, as I mentioned in the beginning, a lot of stability, right? And the kinds of things that I think about, like, okay, when I do have some more like financial independence, how am I going to build my life? What is that going to look like? What are my values? Thinking about that, and then trying to practice the things that I'm attached to, and thinking about attachment like in a spiritual way, but also in a material way. And I don't want to go into my Alwayas mode too much here, but things like really enjoying my cup of coffee and like getting a lot of pleasure from that, and saying like, this is a material thing that I like love, but making sure that there's like a satisfaction in it, and that there's like a routine to it, and like some sort of attachment, and almost like aesthetics or poetics around these things that can give you satisfaction, so that you don't get as easily caught up in the mentality that in order to be happy, you have to consume and then have this and then have this and then have that. And that kind of like, that kind of narrative, which really fuels this whole kind of problem of self-interest and greed, is that we just need more and more and more and more just to be okay. And so kind of grappling with that in so many ways. I think getting down to the granular and like appreciating, that sounds so trite, but I think that for me, at least, that's like a practice, and something I talk to my students in university about too, is really getting down to that sort of gratitude about those things, and non-material things as well, so that we can think about, well, what kind of future would I want to build?
You know, as you both are talking about narratives and you know, the experiences that we've grown up with, our families have grown up with, our parents. I want to ask you guys one last question as we're getting close to the wrap up, is what are some major narratives in our Ismaili community, like for example, meritocracy perhaps, and how can we connect them to the ideas of education and success that you guys have been talking about? But how do we change the narrative of this education and success in our community?
That's such a good question. I mean, I wish I had a canned answer. I think we haven't talked very much about the community through through its institutional lens, let's say. You know, when you think about the relationship between the reciprocal relationship between culture and institutions, one thing you might say is that if someone builds a hospital or is interested in healthcare, they really don't have to talk about their commitment to healthcare. They've kind of built the institution that you know what it's for. If a school goes up, you know they probably care about education. And if they're working in development, notwithstanding some of the critiques of the term and its history, but let's suppose that you look at the real life work that happens on the ground in different parts of the world, you probably don't need a statement that says that this is a rights-oriented kind of enterprise. And what I would suggest, is that we need, in the West in particular, not so much in other parts of the Islamic community, because first of all, I don't know enough about that, but in the West, is that we've maybe too easily adopted the language, the vocabulary, and the goals that surround us, that come from our educational institutions, and perhaps even interpreted the vocabulary as it applies to our community internally as more or less aligned with the institutional realities of Canada or the United States or Western Europe. Now, last week I watched this critical conversation with three very thoughtful people, all people who have particularly successful careers and are part of institutions. That is one step, which is to not think of education as merely a tick box where you are living the good life based on certain kinds of appellations. They call you Dr. So-and-so or so-and-so the blank. But what are we doing to rethink the institutions that we're part of? What kind of role did Natasha and I play in our universities and in the culture of higher education to really rethink its narrative, and then to maybe express that narrative explicitly to those who are younger, who are thinking about university as an option. Earlier, I made this point about STEM. I'm not suggesting for even 1 second that STEM subjects are not important. What I think is dangerous for STEM itself is the way we characterize it. Mathematics in my university is now more an instrument to an end than it is intrinsically valuable. Philosophy is an instrument to an end rather than intrinsically valuable. But what is intrinsic value? It's this idea of rethinking ourselves, to take our histories, to take our philosophies, to take our literature, our mathematics, our science, and to say, here's what it can do, here's where it's efficacious and instrumentally of good, but what can I do to make it better? What's wrong with it? Because everything that you encounter in the university, there's something wrong with it. Everything. There's no right answer to these questions. The ones that are being asked of us today, for example, no easy fix. It's not like changing a washer on a faucet. And as my wife would say, I can't even do that. So there's no easy way of doing it. But if we're talking about larger questions, ethical, moral, historical questions, that takes a lot of energy. And that will take a lot of us working together, talking, but actually getting the kinds of education that gives us the ability not to just get a job, but to be critical of our inheritance and to think about what kind of world we want to leave behind. Everything about the university should be, in my opinion anyway, should be cultivating that critical eye to help revise what's inherited all the time.
I think one way that I'm thinking about doing this at work, and then also within my work with Jamaati institutions, and then in general too, is to center experience and emotions up front, which can often disarm people. And I noticed that I really enjoy it actually. But I think it's really useful to speak in that way, because from what I have seen, the more we can get away from talking about our experiences, emotions, and like the truths of our lives, the more credibility we're given. And I think that has a lot to do with supremacy in general and the way that it functions. So without completely sacrificing ourselves and putting ourselves on the line to be sort of having our emotions and stories exploited, I think in a way that feels powerful, and when we have people in the room we know will hold us down, I think being able to center that first and to insist that people take that seriously, instead of sort of relying on what people would refer to as data. I think that that is really important, and paying attention to even the story of one person and their experience, their backstory. I think that's really important. And I have been finding that, I try to avoid the Facebook chat groups, but recently I, made the mistake of going on, and then I couldn't sleep, because it's like some of the people I know their backstory a little bit. And it's like, we don't see that when we're just commenting to each other and interacting, and we're not changing. We're just patting ourselves. This is my editorial now. I think we're patting ourselves on the back a lot, and it's still all about representation. But I think, how can we make that representation and present it and perform our identities, because it's always a performance? How can we do that in a way that is really disarming and trying to shift away from some sort of pretense of like professionalism, and really, which I think, there are critiques all the time I hear from people who I'm close to within the Jamaati institutions, that we need to professionalize more. And to me, sometimes I worry that that becomes sort of a code for, we need to act more like the supremacist organizations and structures that are incredibly patriarchal, Eurocentric, etc. And I don't think so. I really like to sort of be able to talk for 30 minutes just about whatever, or decide, hey, should we have an outfit change at the like, I like these sort of ways of being in community with each other. To me, that is more meaningful, more liberatory than making sure that we have like a really great spreadsheet. Not to say we can't do both at the same time, but I think that there are some things, some discourses, some ways of talking and experiencing each other, which we need to absolutely center in our work. And speaking the language of emotions and experiences and having time to witness each other is something that I think needs to be at the forefront. What I want to push back against is, as soon as there is someone who says their experience and their trouble, someone else comes in with a solution. And that is incredibly paternalistic, and there's so much wrong with it. And so I just think sitting with that and being together in community with the pain, if that could happen, I would be so happy. To me, that's the kind of change, or I would be so sad, I guess. That's the kind of change that I would, want to see.
I think you and Doreen providing the space today, to be able to relate in that manner is really, really powerful. So thank you to both. Thank you, Dr. Merchant and Dr. Dharamsi. Thank you, audience, for joining us today. Hopefully this is just a start of the critical conversation, and today was such a treat for me, as I hope it was for you that are watching. Thank you again. Just a couple of announcements before you go, audience. Please do take the survey at the end of the session that will pop out on your screen as you leave. Please also look out for information on our next critical conversation and a number of other initiatives that the council and other institutions are organizing. And they're all related to faith and social justice and deepening our knowledge of systemic inequities and biases. And this upcoming week, we actually have a number of young adult conversations related to this topic for the audience. So for more information, you know where to go. Please see Smiley USA on social media platforms. Thank you. Yali Madad.